Conservative Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito has taken the bold and public position that apparently checks and balances don't apply to the Supreme Court, only Congress and the presidency. And before we unpack all that, if you haven't yet, please hit that like, subscribe, and the alert bell, and maybe check out my Patreon because I'd appreciate the support. So, Samuel Alito, who was appointed by President George W. Bush, I think back in 2006, he's taken a public position that basically, listen, he and his fellow 8 lifetime appointees to the highest court in the land, the court which can strike down congressional laws as unconstitutional or executive action, executive orders from the president as unconstitutional, apparently they don't have to be recipients of checks and balances. The court can interfere with the presidency and it can interfere with the Congress whenever it wants, but apparently that doesn't work the other way. As soon as they get that seat and those robes, that's when checks and balances end, apparently. So what am I talking about? Well, for context, we've heard about recent allegations of corruption from or regarding Clarence Thomas and Alito himself, who are 2 conservative justices on the Supreme Court, in terms of their failure to disclose either on time or just at all lavish gifts that they've received from conservative billionaire benefactors, right? Suggesting corruption, okay? Because very often these people actually have business before the court. So for this and a variety of other reasons, Democrats in particular in Congress have been like, look, Supreme Court, you guys just don't get a blank check to do whatever you want. Congress has ethical guidelines that are imposed on us. The executive branch has ethical guidelines imposed on them. You guys don't get to be an exception here. You have to behave ethically. You have to disclose this stuff, blah, 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 blah. The problem is that the Supreme Court's code of conduct is, as far as they're concerned, literally it's just a courtesy. Like the code of conduct which applies to other federal courts and is enforced, the Supreme Court has publicly taken the position, well, listen, we're not obligated to follow it. We just choose to, okay? It's discretionary. That's really dangerous. So eventually Congress has said, the Democrats in Congress have said, look, Chief Justice Roberts, if you're not going to create a code of conduct and enforce it on your court, then we will pass a law requiring you to do so. Now, I'll also say that because Republicans are perfectly satisfied with this iteration of the Supreme Court, they're really not in a hurry to try to regulate the court, even though it would also apply to liberal justices as well, like Kagan and Sotomayor and Justice Jackson. This would be good for everybody. But because conservatives are happy with the way things are on this court, they're not in a rush to back the Democrats' proposal. However, in response to this, Justice Alito apparently did an interview that was published in the Wall Street Journal, and he said, listen, Congress did not create the Supreme Court. I know this is a controversial view, but I'm willing to say it. No provision in the Constitution gives them the authority to regulate the Supreme Court, period. Now, before we dive into anything else, actually, I do want to add this one other part. Apparently, and it's later on in the article, he was asked, basically, are you the only one who thinks this way? He says, I don't know that any of my colleagues have spoken about it publicly, so I don't think I should say, but I think this is something we've all thought about. And I really want to make this part clear. It's entirely possible that Alito's very dangerous view here on regulation and checks and balances of the Supreme Court by Congress, it's entirely possible that he's not the only one. And it's entirely possible that that view is shared by liberal justices on the court. Because let's be honest, if you were a member, one of 9 Supreme Court justices elected for life, you know, it's tempting to not want to have any checks on your authority. But the bottom line is it's dangerous. And also the bottom line is it's just not true. There is actually at least one place that I can think of in the Constitution, and it's Article 3, which discusses the Supreme Court, Section 2. It says, in all cases affecting ambassadors or other public ministers and consuls and those in which a state shall be party, the Supreme Court shall have original jurisdiction. In all other cases before mentioned, the Supreme Court shall have appellate jurisdiction, both as to law and fact, and with such exceptions and under such regulations as Congress shall make. The bottom line is, and Alito might say, well, okay, well, that doesn't talk about ethical behavior. But the bottom line is, when he says that there's nothing in the Constitution that gives Congress the power to regulate the court, he's just false. He's just wrong on the facts. It says so very clearly. In fact, the word regulation is explicitly used. Congress can, in certain contexts, regulate the court. Because here's the other thing. It was clearly intended by the Founding Fathers, as I mentioned in other videos, for the Congress to be the most powerful of the 3 branches. They're co-equal in the sense that there's a division of labor. Executive power largely resides with the president. Judicial interpretation largely resides with the Supreme Court. And legislative power resides with Congress. But checks and balances apply to all of these things. And at the end of the day, Congress basically is supreme among them. So if you think about it, the president has the power to veto. That's a check that the president has on Congress. But Congress can theoretically, and has, overridden the president's veto. So as I mentioned in one of my conversations when I streams with Stacks, it's almost like a game of like who's on top, right? So Congress passes a law or passes a bill. The president can veto, but they have the power to override the veto, and there's nothing the president can do if that happens. The same thing with the Supreme Court, in theory at least, right? Impeachment, constitutional amendments, that's the big one. If Congress passes an amendment, there's nothing the Supreme Court can do about it. There's no, so it's like Congress passes a law, the Supreme Court strikes it down as unconstitutional. In theory, Congress can go, okay, well, we're just going to change the Constitution. And the Supreme Court can't do anything about it. They can't strike down a constitutional amendment as unconstitutional, right? So clearly, to whatever extent people value the wisdom of the Founding Fathers clearly intended when the Congress is firing on all cylinders, it's the most powerful. But the thing is, too, the notion of checks and balances, that's something that's supposed to affect all of the branches. It's not just Congress having checks on the president and balanced with the president and vice versa. The Supreme Court's supposed to be no exception to that. And think about it. Why would it not be? Why would it be an exception? The Founding Fathers, again, to whatever extent you're appealing to their wisdom, they just waged a war against an unelected monarch with absolute power and no checks and balances, really. I mean, there was the parliament at the time, but the nature between the relationship, the power dynamic between the monarch at the time and parliament was much more even than what it currently is. Why would they basically go from that to 9 unelected monarchs with no checks and balances? Clearly, that's insane. You know, if you get a lifetime appointment, you don't have to be elected. You don't have to be reelected. This idea that you basically get a blank check to do whatever you want is insane. It's untenable. So not only is Alito just wrong in the Constitution, but as this great clip I want to play from a conversation with Mehdi Hassan and a writer at Salon, as he kind of points out, he just makes the case it's really absurd what Alito's trying to say here.
I mean, the Constitution literally uses the word regulation to say what Congress can do to the Supreme Court, and yet Alito claims that no provision gives Congress the authority to regulate his court. It cannot be squared. The guy is just lying. And I think what Steve is trying to say there and making such an important point is that for most of our country's history, Congress did regulate the Supreme Court. You know, it added or subtracted seats.
That right there is a good point. Justice Alito only has his seat right now because of a federal statutory law passed by Congress. There's nothing in the Constitution which says that the Supreme Court shall have 9 justices. As a matter of fact, I think if I remember correctly, at the beginning of this country, there was a Chief Justice, because that I think that one is mentioned in the Constitution. But then there was like 3 or 4 justices or 5, and then eventually it was expanded to 9 and locked in around the time of the Civil War. So Justice Alito would literally not even have a seat on the Supreme Court if not for congressional regulation. So if that's the case, then he might as well just resign right now, right? Because the only reason he has a seat is because of congressional regulation. So if congressional regulation doesn't apply, then Alito, you just might as well quit right now.
Forced the court to hear certain cases and took away the power to hear other cases. It moved forward certain hearings for totally partisan purposes. I'm not saying all of that is good, but it shows that embedded in the Constitution is this idea of checks and balances among all 3 branches. Alito seems to think that the Supreme Court sits atop the government and simply doles out checks and balances to the other 2 branches. That is not how it works. If Congress wanted to turn Sam Alito's chambers into a transgender health clinic, it would have full constitutional authority to do so. And I think deep down he knows that, and he's scared of it, and that's why he wants to go out and tell the American people the opposite.
100%. And it's also weird when I was looking through Twitter on this, just seeing reactions to it, like particularly like AOC made a comment on it, which is, again, just kind of hammering the point home. What a surprise. The guy who's supposed to enforce checks and balances thinks checks shouldn't apply to him. Too bad. Corruption and abuse of power must be stopped, no matter the source. In fact, the court should be most subject to scrutiny because it's unelected and lifetime appointed. Again, I think that's a very fair and compelling case. And I think overwhelmingly this idea is relatively popular, but seeing like right-wing trolls, people who are ostensibly conservative, attack this position is so weird to me. So conservatives believe in avoiding absolute power on paper and government overreach, but you're defending the idea that a lifetime unelected person should have checks and balances. Don't apply to them. They apply to Congress, they apply to the president, but not the Supreme Court. Really, it's such a contradiction in terms. It demonstrates the ideological and unprincipled position of modern conservatism as we know it, certainly the Republican Party. And it also goes to show that Samuel Alito, in addition to opining a very dangerous position, is just wrong on the Constitution. And that's kind of scary when you consider that he's a Supreme Court justice who is supposed to interpret the Constitution. You would think he would know a bit about the document he's trying to interpret.